it's a real pleasure to have John Abowd talking to us today about the Census Bureau's use of differential privacy. So John is the Associate Director for Research and Methodology, as well as Chief Scientist since 2016, although he's been involved with the Census Bureau since 1998. And he's leading the development of differentially private disclosure avoidance systems. And he's also an emeritus professor at Cornell, so a very special guest.
Thanks again for the invitation, and I'm happy to be here, and I am speaking in my official capacity, but any views or opinions expressed in this talk are mine and not the Census Bureau's. So I'm going to talk about the adoption of differential privacy as the framework for protecting publications from the 2020 census. We call this BLUF at the Census Bureau, bottom line up front. Going from suppression to differential privacy is much easier than going from publishing all the microdata to differential privacy. And so many of my early experiences with the Census Bureau were the first phrase, but bringing the 2020 census under the control of a differential privacy framework was definitely the second thing, and it's not nearly as straightforward. So I think some of you may know this, but the Census Bureau is not a stranger to formally private confidentiality protection systems. I'm showing you a screen. I was going to update it, but I decided that I would leave it as I made it about a year ago. This is from the On the Map application, which has a formally private system protecting the residential addresses. You can now get data through 2019 in this application. What this screen shows you, the deck is also, you can redistribute the desk, and the slide is slide link. And the note on this slide is the actual reproduction URL. If you insert it to On the Map, you'll get this exact graphic back. So this is where all the people who live inside the orange entity, which is Ithaca, who work within this orange entity, where they live, resolved to their census block, and that resolution is protected by a formally private system that was installed in 2008. And this is the latest product that's been released with differential privacy. The On the Map was an early form of approximate differential privacy. This is an application that shows you the employment outcomes for veterans by the job that they had in the military and the industry and earnings when they leave, to quite considerable detail on up to 10 years out from their military service, protected by an algorithm that is differentially private. And I will say that some of the same people were involved in the veteran employment outcomes as were involved in On the Map. Ashwin Machanabahala was the consulting computer scientist in the design of the protection system used here. And he and Dan Kiefer were graduate students and postdocs for Johannes Gurka back at Cornell when the On the Map system was designed. So these are the data products that are published by the census. The apportionment of the House of Representatives, which happened on April 26th of 2021. What is known as the PL 94-171 redistricting data summary file, which was released on August 12th in 2021. And no differential privacy was applied to the apportionment populations of the 50 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, although the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico do not figure into the apportionment formula used by the House of Representatives to reallocate its 435 seats by statute. Coming products include demographic and housing characteristics, the successor to what was known as Summary File 1 in 2010 and earlier. Detailed demographic and housing characteristics, the successor to what was known as Summary File 2 and the American Indian Alaska Native Hawaiian Tribal Area Summary File, which is the last one. So in 2010, that assembly of data products was more than 150 billion statistics generated from 15 gigabytes of total data. And it was a challenge to do confidentiality protection using the tools that were available for the 2010 census. The microdata were swapped and the tabular summaries were aggregated. And in the case of the predecessors of the detailed demographic and housing characteristics and the AIANNH summary file, there was also some suppression based on the population sizes in the geographic areas. We undertook a set of experiments to determine whether the tabular summaries were sufficient to reconstruct the 2010 microdata. And they were. So we were able to reconstruct one record for every 308,745,538 million individuals. And that reconstruction was quite accurate, and I'm going to show you statistics from it, but I want to make a couple of high-level points because they really drive the point home. There was one record for every person, and that exactly matched the underlying confidential data because the number of persons in the census is a public number all the way down to the units count. But their block location was correct. It was correct on every single record, as was whether you were voting age or not, because no disclosure avoidance had been provided for those two things. There was no location protection, and there was no protection of your voting age. All of the other statistics were protected by the swapping algorithms that were in place and by other procedures that were used on group quarters data. The research confirmed that the microdata could be very accurately reconstructed, and that the tabulation variables were available for 100% of the unit records on the confidential data file. That was an unknowing but direct violation of the 2010 disclosure avoidance standards. This has nothing to do with differential privacy. It has to do with the rules that were laid out for publishing census data from the 2010 census. A different set of rules was used for tabular summaries and for microdata, on the assumption, incorrect as it turns out, that you couldn't reconstruct the microdata from the tabular summaries. So had the reconstructed microdata been presented for release, it would have been denied. It would have been denied because it wasn't a sample, it was 100%. It had a geographic area identifier, the census block ID, that represented areas with populations less than 100,000, considerably less than 100,000. The average size in population of a census block in 2010 was 29 persons. If you only count the blocks that had people in them, it was 50 persons. That was the average size. And certain demographic characteristics were required to have a population of 10,000 nationally before they could be tabulated in a public use microdata sample. Many of the racial and ethnic categories that you can see in the reconstructed microdata had national populations far below 10,000. So how much of an agreement was there? So these numbers have been quoted and misquoted pretty extensively, but I'm going to try to help you understand exactly what they mean. So the reconstructed data are referred to in this table as reconstructed. And, the beeping is my census computer going to sleep. And the left file is two different versions of the confidential census data for 2010. Ceph is the census edited file. That is the historical record of the 2010 census with all of the edits and imputations, filling in characteristics so that every record for every person and every housing unit and every group quarter is complete. The HDF is the version of the CEF that has been swapped and has had other disclosure limitation procedures applied to the group quarters data. So in the reconstructed data, the tabulation variables that we reconstructed, and we did not reconstruct all the tabulation variables. We reconstructed block, sex, age in years, all 63 OMB categories, also referred to as SPD, Statistical Policy Directive 15 categories, and Hispanic or non-Hispanic Latino ethnicity. Those were the variables we reconstructed. 46% of the reconstructed records are an exact match for the CEF on all of those variables, bit for bit. Compared to the swapped file, which is the one that was actually tabulated, it's 48%. If you allow, on top of exact match, a fuzzy age match, which means age needs to match plus or minus 1 year, it goes up to 71% against the CEF and 73% against the HDF. And if you allow for one error, and only one error, it's 78% against the CEF and 80% against the HDF. That's the table that got the decision made in 2018 to replace swapping as the primary protection mechanism for 2020 data publications. Didn't have anything to do with reconstruction. It was a with re-identification. It was a demonstration that we had effectively released the microdata for these 5 tabulation variables. And the reason is that the swapping protections operated on the assumption that you would not consider all the tables that related to a particular person or housing unit at once. Right? That is, that you wouldn't be able to detect population uniques using the tables by themselves. But 57% of the 2010 population was a population unique. The only person in the data with that combination of block, sex, age, race, and ethnicity. And in addition, 44% were population uniques on just block, age, and sex, the primary indicators that you would use for a reconstruction embedded re-identification attack. Block is equivalent to knowing your address. Age and sex are obvious. So then we conducted record linkage-based re-identification experiments. And they're summarized in this table. So 4 different commercial data sources were joined to produce the commercial data that were used in this simulated record linkage attack. So they had 413 million records in them. Obviously, those need to be deduplicated. So the technique that's used to deduplicate them is the production record linkage system that was in place for the 2010 census. And so you'll see in the next column, which says records with PIC, block, sex, and age, that variable PIC is an internal identifier that is the output of our name and address record linkage system. And so it can be used, effectively it stands for your name and address. And it deduplicates the commercial data because you just keep the most complete commercial record that has a PIC, block, sex, and age. You don't have to deduplicate the census. So in the row labeled CEF, the records that have PIC, blocks, sex, and age are what we would call at the Census Bureau a data-defined person in the census. So not every person of those 308,745,538, not every one of them was data-defined. Data-defined means that we got enough individual information about you to use in other operations in the Census Bureau, for example, coverage measurement or record linkage. So getting a PIC means there was enough PII on your CEF record to do record linkage and attach this unique identifier that stands for your name and address. Right. So you then compare the reconstructed data to the commercial data and just use block, age, and sex. And when you do that, 138 million of the records link to the commercial data. And when you do that, 238 million link to the Ceph itself, which is not surprising that it's much harder. You should think of these two experiments as the commercial data represent address, name and address, and birth date information as it was generally available circa 2010 to large-scale data providers. And you should think of the Ceph as what it would be like if a large-scale data provider had name and address information comparable in quality and timeliness to what's collected in the census. Right. To confirm the re-identifications, you then compare the PIC, effectively the name and address, block, sex, age, race, and ethnicity. So a confirmed re-identification means the record flat out matches on every one of the variables, including race and ethnicity, which weren't available in the commercial data. The only way you could add race and ethnicity to the commercial data in this exercise is when they come from the reconstructed data or when they come from some other statistical modeling effort that you might do. Right. In the Ceph, the 179 million in confirmed re-identifications is how many of those records that we attached to name and address to in the reconstructed data exactly matched on name, block, sex, age, race, and ethnicity. So confirmed re-identifications and confirmed re-identification rates are the standard currency for these kinds of studies at the Census Bureau. But we took it a little farther because in the data science world, you would basically talk about recall rates and precision rates. So a recall rate in this definition is what percentage of the data defined people were you able to link? So it's a combination of data quality in the commercial source or the Ceph and the accuracy of the information on the records. So the recall rate for the commercial data was 18%, and the recall rate for the Ceph data was 64%. But the other indicator that you would use in a standard record linkage assessment is the precision rate. So the overall precision is the ratio of the confirmed re-identifications to the putative re-identifications. The overall precision was 38% for the commercial data and 75% for the Ceph itself. This kind of an attack is not a statistical use because, in particular, the way it was structured, the only way to get the race and ethnicity information that's being used in the confirmation is from the reconstructed data. So that means that the reconstructed data supported a non-statistical use of the census tables, namely high precision re-identification of the race and ethnicity answers. But it isn't just the race and ethnicity answers that are at risk from this kind of high precision re-identification attack. The next variable to reconstruct would be the relationship of that person to the person who filled out the survey, who's called a householder in census speak. And then the racial composition of the household is available. The age and sex composition of the household is available. This isn't the only set of variables that can be reconstructed in microdata from those 150 billion statistics. It's just the 5 that figure most prominently in the individual level tables that were published from the 2010 census. But more importantly, the precision of that re-identification attack is much higher in the small blocks that the swapping system was designed to protect. So if you use the commercial data as your source, your precision is 95% in blocks that had populations of between 1 and 9. And that's 8 million people in the 2010 census. Your precision is 79% in blocks of 10 to 49, and that's another 68 million people properly rounded. So you're now up to just about 25% of the population has a very high precision. If you go all the way up to blocks that were 99, cumulative percent of the population is 47%, and the precision is still above a half at 59%. That's using the commercial data. Using the best, worst case in this case, the most accurate attack data that you could use, the precision of that attack is above 50% in every single block. And it's 97% in the smallest blocks and 92% in the next smallest blocks. This is a very precise, successful re-identification attack. So the Census Bureau's decisions were made on the basis of the Reconstruction alone, but the re-identification attacks, simulated re-identification attacks, sealed the deal. So because of the ability to do this, the traditional disclosure avoidance methods are simply insufficient to counter these risks. They cannot be made to accommodate the risk associated with reconstructing the underlying microdata if the tables provide too much detail without sufficient noise. So Title 13 of the US Code, sections 8B and 9, delegate to the Census Bureau arbitrating the diverse use cases and deciding, short of publishing the microdata again, how many users will have their use cases accommodated by the disclosure avoidance system. And balancing the interests of diverse users in trying to set the parameters of a complicated disclosure avoidance system has always been a hard problem. It's just that it's been a backroom activity for the last 30 years, and it's not a backroom activity anymore. There's a very robust public discussion going on as we speak. So all of the 2020 census publications will be protected by a collection of differentially private algorithms. I'm only going to talk about the one that was applied to the redistricting data in this talk. Similar algorithms are being applied to the demographic and housing characteristics, and a different collection of algorithms is being applied to the other products that I talked about earlier. We have released the production code base for redistricting. We've released almost all of the supporting technical documents. There's a Harvard Data Science review paper that I'm still waiting for the editor's final letter on before we post it in working paper form. But we've posted technical papers explaining the problems that are associated with trying to do this by passing through microdata that is about to appear in NeurIPS. We've published a detailed documentation of how we optimized the geographic spine, and we published the actual code base. And there are researchers out there who have used the published code bases to get our system to work, and have also done reconstructions that they are now feeding into our production code base. There's a lot more information at that link. So it's a good thing that a very diverse user community is engaged in the debate about accuracy versus privacy loss. And whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee at the Census Bureau has to be the final arbiter, it is what it is, and so that is what it is, and that's what's happening. And those meetings are some of the most intense and long meetings that the Census Bureau has had in my 5 years in this position. And I've been told by others that they replicate similar incredibly difficult decision-making meetings that DCEP has had in the past when facing really hard decisions about how to implement disclosure avoidance. So I want to talk just briefly about the principal algorithmic decision that supports the redistricting data and the demographic and housing characteristics, which was a decision not to do bottom-up differential privacy, or what in this context would be block by block, where a census block is the smallest geographic unit that any table is ever produced at. So a bottom-up or block-by-block strategy is very similar to the way early implementations of local differential privacy appeared in the Chrome browser and iOS and Windows 10. And it's similar in spirit to the way current implementations of local differential privacy would apply to this problem. You hand all the privacy loss budget to the most granular thing that you want to publish, and then you build all your aggregates from that, or you assign all the privacy loss budget to separate questions and aggregate from the local DP. The block by block method is not local DP. It allocates all the privacy loss budget to block level tabulations and then adds them up. The top-down algorithm allocates privacy loss budget to every query at every level of geography and attempts to balance the accuracy by both query and geographic level. So it's an explicit answer to this dilemma. If you do the bottom-up approach and you apply it to these are figures we released back in 2018. If you apply it to the 1940 census, which is in the public domain, what this accuracy measure is an average total variation distance, but it doesn't really matter exactly what the accuracy measure is. What matters is that it asymptotes to 1 when the data exactly match what's in the confidential file. And so as you increase the privacy loss budget, you can see all of the geographic levels. An enumeration district is the 1940s equivalent of a block. And so as you increase the privacy loss budget, the enumeration district, the county, the state, the nation, they all get closer to 1. But the takeaway from this picture is that they're all basically on top of each other. The data for the nation isn't any more accurate than the data for an enumeration district. A statistical agency just can't use a publication system with that property. The top-down algorithm, by splitting the privacy loss budget across the geo levels, is able to achieve the kind of accuracy privacy loss trade-off that you would expect in a well-designed statistical publication system. For the most granular publications, enumeration districts, the figure in this slide and the figure in this slide don't quite overlap. In fact, top-down algorithm is more accurate at every privacy loss budget than the naive algorithm, but not by a whole lot, so I don't want to stress that. But every other aggregation, county, state, and nation, is much more accurate, reflecting the fact that it's an accumulation of statistics over much larger populations in those areas, and it should be more accurate, and it is. But I can guarantee you that to implement the top-down algorithm, just for redistricting, we had to take 16.6 billion differentially private measurements to implement top-down. And it's going to do a good job that completely satisfies no one. The social choice problem is not solved by having a good algorithm. The social choice problem is solved only by making difficult decisions about which use cases are going to be favored in the implementation. So we summarize that by saying the data need to be accurate, but for whom or to whom? While the DAS operates under interpretable formal privacy guarantees, given its privacy loss budget, accuracy properties depend on output metrics. They depend on the use case that you're tuning them to. That's what an output metric is. How are these data going to be used? A distinct group of data users will have very particular analyses that they think should be particularly accurate. Tuning the accuracy for a given analysis will reduce the accuracy for other analyses with a fixed privacy loss budget. That's just math. The policymakers, in this case, the Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, had to consider overall reasonable accuracy metrics and privacy trade-offs, and it's not an easy problem. Right? I'm going to take you on a deep dive into redistricting and then take questions. So redistricting is the use case for the redistricting data. And this is at a high level. What do redistricting data have to do? They have to be able to determine legislative voting districts where the politically defined entity can be of an arbitrary size. Some politically defined entities have fewer than 1,000 people in them, and they still get voting districts, although they're much more likely at that size to have at-large voting. Those districts, the voting districts, must have approximately equal populations, but their exact boundaries can't be known in advance because that's what's going to be drawn. The only boundary known in advance is the legislative district that you're drawing the voting districts for and how many districts you need to draw. The districts also have to be consistent with Section 2 scrutiny under the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which means that large minority populations can't be clustered into a few districts. Majority minority districts, approximately 50% plus minority population, must be drawn when feasible. And that enforcement activity is a statistical use of the redistricting data that the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division undertakes in evaluating voting rights, proposed voting plans. Section 2 scrutiny is after the fact. Section 5 scrutiny is before the fact, but the Supreme Court invalidated the Section 5 scrutiny for this next round of redistricting, so there's no Section 5 scrutiny to consider anymore. So the focus statistics are the total population and the ratio of the largest race or ethnic population to total population. That's the actual statistic that gets used in forming a majority-minority district. What complicates this? Well, it's complicated by the fact that the Census Bureau's geographic hierarchy branches from census blocks at the bottom and then goes through this hierarchy, blocks to block groups to tracts to counties to states to the nation that the top-down algorithm was built on. But these political entities, they're off this spine. So there are things like county subdivisions, what are called minor and sub-minor civil divisions, congressional districts, school districts, state legislative districts, they're all off this spine. So tuning so that the statistics would be accurate required spine optimization. And I won't talk about it very much today, but we put a technical paper out on how that was done. In addition, you see this AIA and NH areas off to the side here. They're hard off the spine. They basically have their own spine that starts with census blocks, but doesn't share any of the other political boundaries with the core spine on this slide. So they had to be separately handled in the spine optimization as well. So here's an example of actual redistricting data use that basically just confirms what I told you about how it's done. This is the Senate district in New York State that I lived in when I was a resident of Ithaca, New York, and how Senate District 48 was assessed for Voting Rights Act enforcement in the 2010 redistricting plan of the state of New York. And you can see the statistics that I was talking about. How many people are in the district, and then what percentage of them are in these major race and ethnicity groups. This is a predominantly white voting district for Senate District 48. And the same is true of the State Assembly District 125 that covered the area where I lived when I was in New York. And the same sort of statistics. So this basically just shows you that the statistic that matters is the ratio of large enough to be noticed racial and ethnic minorities to the total population. So how do you get accuracy in this kind of statistic? So what we did was design an alpha beta accuracy metric that took the absolute value of the difference between a statistic calculated from the top-down algorithm and the same statistic calculated in the census evidence file, and asked for it to be less than or equal to alpha percentage points in error at least 1 minus beta percent of the time. And the statistic is the population of the largest race or ethnic group in whatever geography is being defined as a proportion of the total population. And so in the tuning, alpha was set to 0.05 and beta was set to 0.05. And in the tuned algorithm, for a minimum population of 200 to 250 in all of the political areas that we considered, 95% of the time, the error in this statistic is less than 5 percentage points. For block groups, which are the next run up on the census hierarchy, it's accurate 95% of the time. for block groups of between 450 and 499, and for every block group size bigger than that, also for every political area bigger than 200 to 249. To do that, you have to spend quite a lot of privacy loss budget, and you have to spend it very carefully. So I think probably some of you know, Thomas in particular, that we use zero concentrated differential privacy. And so the allocation parameter is the row for that system implemented with the discrete Gaussian mechanism. Translating it to approximate differential privacy at 17.44 at 10 to the minus 10. But one of the big advantages of using ZCDP is that it lets you reason about the entire privacy loss random variable and not just the extreme values. We have a semantics paper coming out about how we did that reasoning, right? But there are 29 million tables, 3.4 billion statistics, and 1.5 billion linearly independent statistics released with the redistributor. So still a very large data load being managed within that privacy loss budget. So I have a whole lot of accuracy statistics, but I'm not going to show them all to you. I'm just going to show you the evolution of the accuracy as the privacy loss budget was manipulated. So one of the key concerns was that counties are a major political population area. And in the original releases, which were not tuned at all, they were literally the first runs ever from the top-down algorithm at scale for the full set of statistics. The error for county population was about 82.2 persons. The improvement all the way down to the one labeled April 2021 epsilon 4.5, that's all algorithmic improvement. The rest of the improvement to epsilon of 12.2 or to rho of 2.63 got to an average error for populations of 1.75 persons. This is the average L1 error, the mean absolute error that I'm showing in the call out, and the L1 percentage error in the graph. But that's as you can see from the algorithmic tuning, that wasn't particularly challenging. What was challenging was getting it down for smaller population counties, and that was accomplished almost entirely algorithmically as well, as you can see from the April 2021 epsilon 4.5 figure. But even harder was these off-spine entities. These were a very serious challenge, and every single one of the releases got better, but still had relatively high mean absolute percent error until we started piling on privacy loss budget, carefully tuned at the block group and above label. And that got these political entities down to a mean absolute error of 3.6 persons, or a mean absolute percent error below 1%. Right. I'm showing you these accuracy figures, reminding you that for the target use case redistricting, every one of the production runs and the April 2021 epsilon 12.2 run meet those criteria everywhere. So this is on top of the redistricting use case. So even small places in minor civil divisions have very accurate redistricting populations. It's hard to put this in context, but let me try. This error for the counties is swamped by the error in the 2010 census itself in putting a person in the wrong county, which is only 0.3%. All right. I'm not going to go through the rest of these, but you have the deck and you can. I'm going to go straight to where the rubber meets the road. So the extra accuracy that the DCEP put on the redistricting data was to get this most detailed cross of Hispanic ethnicity by the Statistical Policy Directive 15 race categories down so that the mean absolute error, which is the average L1 error, was below 5 persons for every one of these categories. And you can see that that was achieved in the production settings. I'm sorry, it wasn't, the target wasn't for the county, at the tract level. That was the target, added on after the redistricting targets had been met. Okay, and that's where the extra privacy loss budget from a row of about 1.7 to a row of 2.6 comes from. I'm not going to go into GQ types. So I am going to show you, though, that uncertainty in the block level data remains relatively high and was actually increased in the production settings. So this urban-rural block has been called out a lot as an area of particular concern. This isn't a fair comparison of the DAS to what was done in 2010 because the urban, what's defined as an urban or a rural population, block depends on the population. So you have to redo the definitions to get a fair comparison. But I'm showing you this to show you that there's still quite a bit of location uncertainty left in the 2010 data, even at the production settings. You can see that in the difference between the April 2021 epsilon 12.2 and the production settings, the mean absolute error for rural blocks or urban blocks. Okay. In addition, these inconsistencies between housing unit data and person data are a deliberate consequence of having randomness in both the occupied housing units and the populations in blocks. They are the uncertainty due to the disclosure avoidance system, and they are deliberate. So we brought privacy protection out of the shadows, which I count as the most transparent discussion since the 1980s discussion of replacing suppression with some alternative to suppression, which was swapping as it was used in the 1990 census. You can get more information from the links I've provided here and more selected resources. And now I will stop sharing my screen and we can go into Q&A.